everything is changing and you've had to bring a new work out there about making the most of this disorder, the chaos that's around us. Would you like to just sum up what the broad context is in which the argument you build up?
Thank you, Manu. And first of all, thank you all for being here. Good afternoon to everyone. It's absolutely wonderful to be back in Kozhikode. I've been coming pretty much every year since this festival began. And the crowds get better and the bigger and the weather gets nicer and the subjects are even more interesting every year. So wonderful to see you all. On Manu's question, there really are two major differences with my book, Pax Indica. One is that, of course, that approaches the question of India's role in the world from India. So the whole approach is this is India's background, India's foreign policy, India's political imperatives, and with this background, India should do this and this and that. That was my approach. Whereas this book takes the opposite view in that it looks at the world, the whole patterns of global governance which have governed the world for the last 72 years since the end of the 75 years almost since the end of the Second World War. And it argues from that analysis that there is need for a new paradigm of global governance, and it argues that India should step up and play a useful role. Now, when Manu talked about how unpredictable everything has become around the world, he's totally right, because what you're seeing now is a world in which, unfortunately, I think it's the phone that's the culprit. Unfortunately, we are in a situation in which the old geopolitical stability that the world took for granted over 7 decades after the end of the Second World War has ended. It ended, in a sense, with the end of the Cold War to begin with, but there was a certain other kind of stability that followed for another decade and a half, what was called by an American commentator, Charles Krauthammer, the Unipolar Moment. So you had the binary division of the Cold War, then you had the Unipolar Moment when the US alone dominated the world. But since about a decade now, maybe slightly less, everything has turned topsy-turvy. And in the US now, the election of President Trump has given you an extremely mercurial figure who seems to change his mind with every second tweet. And it becomes very difficult to figure out how America is going to be a force for stability in the world. All the messages America has been selling to the rest of the world about its willingness to stand up for democracy and human rights, its emphasis on free trade, increasing economic globalization, all of those have been turned on their heads by President Trump, who's doing exactly the opposite of what his predecessors had preached to the world for all this time. And then secondly, you've got what I describe as two backlashes against globalization. There is the economic backlash that many of you have read about in your newspapers, which is the backlash particularly in the developed world, where blue-collar workers, but also others, have found that their dreams of a better life have been dashed by these irresistible global forces that have taken jobs away from America to Shanghai. We literally Shanghaied their jobs, where the kind of American dream, as the expression went, where literally each generation could expect to live in bigger and better homes and drive bigger and faster cars and essentially be more affluent than the preceding one, a dream that was sustained for several generations, that dream has suddenly been dashed on the hard rocks of globalization. So there is that economic backlash. You see it particularly in America, but you see it also in many Western countries where versions of the same phenomenon have occurred. The fruits of economic globalization have been distributed unevenly. In every country in the Western world, including America, inequality has never been greater. The rich have progressively got very much richer. There is a smaller number of people are controlling a larger portion of their country's assets and income and resources, and the poor have got progressively poorer. And at the same time, in addition to all of this, there is what I would call a cultural backlash. The cultural backlash is against cosmopolitanism, against migration, against the movement of people across borders, often in search of different jobs. And it's often being conducted in the name of greater authenticity, rooted in place, rooted in religion, rooted in ethnicity. So that when Mr. Trump says, "Make America great again," he's also, as it were, silently whispering, "Make America white again." There's this image of the ideal American life behind the white picket fence that was essentially part of his cultural appeal to many voters. You see this in Marine Le Pen in France. You see it in the Brexit vote. Brexit in Britain, in many ways, is a vote about hearing foreign languages being spoken in the streets of England. And these are the kinds of cultural backlashes that are taking place. And you see the rise then of ethno-nationalist populists, people coming to power in these countries who are absolutely riding the crest of these backlashes and saying that as far as they're concerned, they stand for a more authentic version of their nationalism. And we are not unfamiliar with this in India, because in many ways, the phenomenon of Narendra Modi epitomizes this cultural backlash here. He too represents a kind of ethno-nationalist populism, except it's not ethno, it's religio-nationalist populism with the Hindutva message and the Hindu identity politics that he's pushing. So we've got this kind of very uncertain world. You got some who combine both the economic and the cultural backlash, like Trump. You have those who combine, who don't combine them, who have not participated in the economic backlash, like Modi in India or Erdogan in Turkey, but who very much participated in the cultural backlash. So in their own countries, they are cultural nationalists. Internationally, they want to be Davos man rather than reject Davos man. So Manu, that is the context within which I've tried to trace the kind of disorder the world is in, talked about the way in which global governance has manifested itself in 7 decades in the fields of peace and security, in the fields of development, sustainable development, environment, climate change negotiations, in the question of the way in which the whole business of space, cyber security, and so on have been managed, and finally coming up with an analysis that says that in this new world disorder, we need a new paradigm. We can't just leave it to the way in which the world was organized in 1945 to take us into the 3rd decade of the 21st century.
You know, when you were speaking, it reminded me of this old story from 19th century Trivandrum. When the Maharaja of Travancore wanted to get the railways to Trivandrum, all the priests in the temple said, "Illa pattilla," you know, the Tivandi can't defile this sacred space. But the priests in Puri, far away in Orissa, where the Jagannath temple is, they were more than happy, because they very quickly realized that a journey from Calcutta to the Puri temple that took 3 weeks on foot could suddenly happen in 12 hours, and suddenly there were more pilgrims coming. There was more money coming to the temple, and the identity of the temple was boosted. It's a little bit like this with the current scenario also, where all these people raging against globalization are also beneficiaries of globalization in many ways. That is a great irony. They're using the internet, they're using the framework that a globalized system has created to now, in a way, scuttle that or destabilize and try and create a new world order. Nobody knows what that world order is, but there is, don't you think there's an irony in that globalization has supplied the tools for this?
Yes and no, because, you know, the fact is that if you look at the West, the Western consumer got cheaper goods, but they're now being made in China and not in Michigan or Pennsylvania. And so from the point of view of the Western consumer, what is the point of cheaper goods if you can't afford them because your salary has been halved or your job has been gone, has been taken away? That's essentially, I think, where the irony is a little more explicable. But then you look at other countries, look at a place like China, which is perhaps the biggest beneficiary of globalization, because their economy has been transformed. If you date globalization as being something from roughly 1980 to about 2008 when the economic recession hit, if you were to look at that, then I'm afraid it's very clear that the biggest victory in those 28 years was for the Chinese people. Their economy multiplied from $92 billion in 1980 to whatever it is, 15 trillion or something today. You can't even do the multiples very easily in your head of how much of an increase that represents. And if you look at India and China, There's a stark comparison for you. Our economies were the same size at the beginning of the globalization era, which meant in per capita terms we were ahead because we had fewer people. Today, their economy is 5 times ours, and in per capita terms, they are well ahead. So we're looking at a country, and they've done it, of course, on the backs of their hardworking people. Don't get me wrong, I'm not disparaging that. The factories that have churned out goods for the world have also transformed China's reputation. They're now creative, they're innovative, they're doing new products that they could never do before. I remember when I was at graduate school in the States in the mid-70s, people saying that the Chinese couldn't even make a Jeep, they had to get it from the Russians. That was the American assumption about China in the mid-70s. It's transformed. Now there's nothing the Chinese can't make and make better and cheaper than anyone else. But for Indians, it's a paradox. We were very slow to climb onto the bandwagon of globalization. Ours is a far more integrated economy now than it ever was. But it took us a while to get there at a much slower pace than China. And in many ways, now that the movement is away, we may not have gained as much as we could have had we moved faster.
Again, there was this report about how when Jeff Bezos came to India, and he was not given a great welcome this time. There's this op-ed today or yesterday from Shekhar Gupta where he talks about how the BJP is going back to being a Banya party. It's almost like they can't make up their mind. Do you want to compete in the global market or do you want to preserve your small kirana store wala? Okay, coming back to
even the kirana store is a rather kind assumption. I think that the real beneficiary is a certain tycoon who, far from running a kirana store, plans to get into the e-commerce market himself. So, no, my view is that the BJP is looking to its own narrow interests and have long since lost sight of the kind of campaign narrative Mr. Modi sprung on us in 2014 when he talked about a much more liberalized India facing the world economy. And nothing of the sort is happening. And as you know, we have decided not to go in for the regional comprehensive economic partnership because indeed the protectionist instincts of the BJP are reasserting themselves, and we are now deciding on the basis of old fears rather than new aspirations. So the BJP in many ways is not a party that anymore can speak to the aspirations of India's young.
On the global systems that were set up in the post-Second World War phase, you've got the Bretton Woods system, you've got the United Nations, and for a long time there was this romance about the system, the march of democracy, the spreading of wealth around the world, the end of inequality and all of that, which comes crashing in 2008 with the crisis really. This whole mythology, however, in your book you argue that from conception the design was flawed. That in reality it was just these victors of the 1945 phase who actually just designed it. I mean, they had nice intentions perhaps, so they wanted to keep power very much in their hands, and that lopsidedness is being challenged now, and it's just that the global institutions aren't able to respond. So does that mean if the global institutions do manage to, allow more people at the table, that there is a way to salvage the situation? Can we dial things back a little bit and save the day?
Well, it's not impossible. In fact, one of the things that I often point out is that unlike, say, a century ago, when Germany and Japan were actually working to knock down, destroy the world order that had been constructed in the previous century from the Council of Europe in 1815 onwards after Waterloo, you had a kind of global peace across Europe which left out countries like Germany and Japan, and they said we have to break the system because we can't get any place in it. Unlike that, countries like China and India have actually been saying all we want is a place at the high table. We are not anxious to destroy the existing order, but give us place. And frankly, the problem is that whenever you have emerging powers or rising powers, unless the ones who already arose, as it were, in this case in 1945, have the statesmanship and the vision to be able to sort of move their elbows in a little bit and let other people squeeze into the table, then only will the system crack. Now, we had a very good example of this when in 2008, the G8 in Pittsburgh actually said that there should be the same, there should be a transfer-awaited voting in the World Bank and the IMF, the Bretton Woods institutions, towards the emerging and transition economies. Transition economies were the former Soviet Union countries that were entering the free market system. And the emerging were, of course, principally India, China, Brazil, South Africa, and so on, Nigeria, Indonesia. These were meant to be the beneficiaries. Now, at that point in 2008, China has only the same weighted vote in the Bretton Woods institutions as Belgium does. So that was the anomaly that was sought to be corrected. And China is, God knows, 25 times the size of Belgium in terms of economy, forget about population, everything else. But once that was agreed, everyone went away saying, great. And then what happened? Agreements like this need to be ratified by parliamentary institutions, and the US Senate deliberately sat on the agreement and did not ratify it. So what do the Chinese do? They decided to send a signal that you give us a level playing field, we'll play on it with you. But if you don't give us a level playing field, we will build our own playing field. And that was where they set up the Asian Infrastructure Bank, Investment Bank, and then with India, they set up the BRICS New Development Bank, headquartered in Shanghai. And it was a clear message. Okay, you think that the World Bank is the only game in town. We're willing to play along with that. But if you're not going to give us a place, then we will create an alternative World Bank, as it were, for the developing world, and screw you. That was basically the message. I'm putting it very crudely, but that was essentially, I think, though they always gave assurances publicly, that was what they wanted to do. And you can't blame them, because the problem with international affairs is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Okay? I mean, if they're not going to give you a place, placing the orders, as it were, you will be eaten alive for lunch. And many countries that were in the position where their fates were being decided for them by the bigger powers, by the structures of 1945, have suddenly said, look, we've outgrown all of that. We are now ready not just to be rule takers, but also to be rule makers. And in that context, you see the rise of India and China, and other countries, China well ahead of us, as I said earlier. And today, very clearly the existing structures of global governance are no longer adequate. The problem is no one knows how to agree on reforming them.
That's a disappointment with even the BRICS, right? Even in European conferences like at Bucharest, etc., when you mention the BRICS as an alternative, nobody takes it very seriously because it's got internal contradictions of its own. The other thing you mentioned in your book, and it is a very compelling argument, is that so much for the angst and the sort of negative press global forces and global institutions are getting now, the fact of the matter is that in the last 72 years, they have done wonders to the world in general, whether it's statistics, whether it's terms of exchange of wealth. Well, it may not be the fairest treatment, but if you look at the larger scheme of things, the institutions have worked relatively well for a long period of time. So is it fair now that, are we being unhistorical by completely throwing it under the bus when, in fact, it perhaps needs only tweaks? And
they have worked well, but with a caveat in every case. That's where the big but comes in. So if you look at peace and security, we can rightly say, and in my UN days I often said, look, there's been no Third World War. The UN has worked well enough to be able to diffuse potential conflicts that could have ignited a superpower conflict. Fair enough, but conflict didn't disappear. It got exiled to the periphery, and wars continued in developing countries, often with as savage a toll as the wars that grabbed the world's headlines in the 20th century in Europe. But the tendency was because America and Europe were at peace, they generalized that the world was at peace, whereas in fact wars were taking place and did take place. Vietnam, we all know about Cambodia, Laos, Biafra, Nigeria, India, Pakistan in 65, 71, 99. I mean, you go through example after example and you realize that there was peace, but it wasn't for everyone, it wasn't all the time. Similarly, you can say, yes, there was development. Look at the life expectancy of children has increased, people are living longer, healthier lives. All of that is true. And yet it's also true that many of the terms of development were so skewed that the richer countries did far better out of the process than we did. You look at climate change management, environmental issues. The Western world has sort of discovered God, as it were, after having practiced atheism for a few centuries. From the Industrial Revolution, they polluted the world's environment colossally, grew, became rich, and then found virtue and started preaching environmental consciousness to the rest of us. But as I keep pointing out to Westerners, an Indian still, there are about 350 million Indians who cannot take for granted what every Australian or Austrian or American can, which is that they can walk into a room and flick a switch on the wall and be bathed in light. There are so many people in our country who still haven't got that. So we still have to conquer some of those basic challenges. We still have to provide electricity to all these people. And as long as the West is unwilling to provide, for example, the transfer of affordable green technologies to countries like India, India is still continuing to go for old forms of energy generation that will continue to damage the planet. For example, I don't know how many of you noticed, as I wrote an op-ed about it in one of the websites last year, the government released a new energy policy. There's the same government that's been a leading voice in the International Solar Alliance and talking about alternative energy all the time. But their new energy policy actually envisages new investments in new coal-fired thermal plants in the next 10 years. So we are actually going to be making matters worse before we can contribute to making them better. Now, if you look at all of that, they will turn around and say, we can't afford it otherwise. How can we afford to shut down these plants? But the problem is, if you don't, there are other consequences. I mean, pollution is an obvious one. Delhi is a place that is truly unbreathable now. I mean, from about November or even mid-October to about mid-February, Delhi is not a safe place for you to be. And even the rest of the year, the levels of the PMI particles in the air, the AQI, the Air Quality Index, is about 5 to 10 times what the WHO considers to be safe limits. But in the winter, it is much more than 10 times. And at its worst around Diwali, the World Health Organization limit is 25 safe PMI particles 2.5 limit. Instead of 25, in Delhi after Diwali, it had crossed 1,000, 40 times more. And what's more, it may have been well over, but there was no way of measuring anything beyond 1,000, because nowhere else in the world have they needed to measure more than 1,000. So that's how bad things are in that area. So if you look at the challenges facing us, I would argue a disproportionate burden of meeting these challenges still rests on the developing world.
You've alluded to these difficulties a country like India faces in the international context, but these are all economic or climate-related issues. We're also at a very curious phase where, on the one hand, you argue in your book, and even in Pax Indica, the idea was, how do we use these situations to our advantage? How do we ensure that the world as it is emerging is in a shape that we approve of? What's interesting is, can we really do this when within the country, forget the economics of it, culturally, we're caught up in all kinds of disputes. I mean, at the global stage, you're seeing all the countries are caught up in their own feuds and problems and very petty concerns in a way. And in our own country, how are we going to be able to maximize this potential when we haven't even decided who's an Indian, who's not an Indian, and we're caught up in all these cultural debates? And how much does this internal cultural unsettlement affect the possibility of India really going ahead and doing what it needs to do?
I believe it does. And in fact, I should stress that this is a co-authored book, in that it's co-authored with Samir Saran, the president of the Observer Research Foundation. And I think it's fair to point out that in this answer, we'll probably part company. He's still very gung-ho on India under the present leadership, whereas I am profoundly disillusioned with the government of India. And I do believe that the India that could step up and play a significant role in the world is not the India that's busy tearing itself apart in this horribly divisive way. What we are seeing in India today, and I have myself addressed a rally in Kozhikode last month against the CAA. I have been speaking in many parts of the country, including in JNU and Jamia. And I know you just had a session on JNU. I've met with the students there. I've spoken in Jamia. I've spoken in Shaheen Bagh. The passion and determination of ordinary Indians. Most of these people have no affiliation to any particular political party, nor have they been organized there by any particular political party. It's just that they have stood up and said, we must stand up for our vision of our country, for what we believe in as the land we are living in, are going to grow up to run. And as far as we're concerned, we won't stand for this being done to us. But what's sadly happening is that while all this has taken place in the cities, the government is still in a state of denial. They still seem to think that what they're doing, which they're trying to sell as more innocent than it is, but they've convinced themselves that a majority of the nation is with them and that it's only a handful of agitators and leftists and people stirred up by the dangerous Congress party and so on that are actually doing these protests. And I don't know what it's going to take for them to understand that's not the case. But we are in a very difficult position, and this India certainly lacks the credibility it would need to be able to say to the world, we can set an example in any area. The old strength of India was we didn't need to go and proselytize. People turned to us all the time, say, how do you do it? How do you manage so much diversity? How do you conduct these elections in such a large and complex country? How have you managed the challenge of different languages? How have you managed the challenge of different ethnicities? What's your secret? Show us. And we would sort of smile modestly and disarmingly and say, well, you know, the example is available. If you need any help, we're happy to send you experts. But, you know, we're not interested in selling our model. We're just saying that this is the way we've done it, and if you feel that it's relevant to you, we welcome it. That era is sadly now been eclipsed by what's been going on with the Modi government.
So you can't really go out and change the world if you're at war within, and seemingly there are people who want wars within. You also spoke about America earlier, and what's interesting is that you talk about how America, although it often stood a foot away from these institutions, it always had mixed feelings about the United Nations, for example. But America's presence on the global stage, its presence militarily as well, was a massive stabilizing force, which is why America's withdrawal from these conversations in many ways is also one of the reasons for the instability, I imagine. You see this in Europe again. I mean, the fact that America expects Europe to foot some more of the bill for NATO, for example, it's really sent European countries into some sort of, they're running around like headless chicken because they don't know how to deal with this world. So where do you see a future? What, in your view of the future, is America's role in the rest of the century? And how do you think China will come up and try and respond to that?
I mean, there's no question that Trump's America is exactly what you describe. But Trump is really not interested in footing the bill to save Europe. He's not interested in exporting democracy around the world. He couldn't care two hoots about human rights as long as they don't affect him directly. And as far as trade is concerned, he has a very transactional approach. I'll give you this if you give me this. If you don't, then forget it. We're not interested in free trade with you. Which all of this is exactly the opposite of what successive American leaders have preached as the gospel of American presence around the world. And therefore, we are looking at the US as a source of geopolitical uncertainty. And I say uncertainty because while I've tried to characterize Trump coherently, the man himself is anything but coherent. And very frequently, you discover his policy from a tweet sometimes issued in all capitals at 3 a.m., on his phone, in which he rants against someone or something, including sometimes the dictator in North Korea and other favored targets. It doesn't hesitate to insult other heads of state or government. And you never know what the consequences might be, because it's not entirely clear that he has anticipated the consequences before issuing that tweet or that message. So in those circumstances, unpredictability has become a very major feature of American leadership under Trump, and that is something that's worrying. In other countries, I mean, you may have had a shift in policy, and I would say you have had. Many countries in Europe have moved in this ethno-nationalist populism way, as I mentioned earlier, towards the right, but they are predictably, stably right. Viktor Orban is going to take certain positions, and that's the way he's going to go in Hungary, and you know where that's going to go. With Mr. Trump, you don't really know where he's going to go. You have, at best, a broad guess on the basis of his previous behavior, but he can quite quickly turn around. So, for example, on Iran, just recently, you know what happened. He took this extraordinary risk of a bombing raid that killed General Soleimani and a couple of others. The very next day, he issued a tweet threatening to bomb 52 cultural and religious sites in Iran if they retaliated. 2 days later, the Italians and the Iranians retaliated very carefully, rather having learned a lesson from Mr. Modi and Balakot. In Balakot, we claimed we had taught the Pakistanis a lesson, but we hit 3 trees on a deserted hillside and didn't hurt anyone. Similarly, here also, the Iranians managed to hit a base where apparently nobody was killed, and they did so at a time when nobody was there and was asleep and so on. And anyway, to cut a long story short, Mr. Trump then suddenly turned all sweet and emollient and reasonable and said, well, very clearly the Iranians are interested in peace, so I'm not going to proceed with my threat. Now, this kind of thing, in many ways we can all breathe a sigh of relief. I know many friends in the region were bracing for a hail of bombs on places like Dubai if things had got out of control. Now everyone's breathing a sigh of relief that he didn't take it that far. But at the same time, the concern is even that particular act of assassination. I mean, how many world leaders will openly assassinate a general in another country's army in an action that also kills half a dozen other people and get away with it? I mean, this is again a different kind of American exceptionalism we're seeing.
Now, I wasn't going to mention this, but as my last question, I know I'm supposed to leave 15 minutes for the audience, and there will be lots of questions. And I wasn't going to say this because I know your family is very, private about this, but you have dedicated this book to your grandson, Eliseo Kailash Tharoor, I'm assuming. And it's interesting because his very name encapsulates that this is a child of globalization. He's got Kashmiri blood, Bengali blood, Malayali blood, Puerto Rican blood, and American blood in him. And this is to me the child of globalization. We talked about instability in the world, but that obviously breeds chaos and it breeds fear. Are you optimistic about the future your grandson's going to be in?
It's a very, very difficult question to answer, not least because, when one thinks of one's own grandson, one hopes for the best for him. But, America itself is deeply torn. I wrote a piece a few months ago at how suddenly the word socialism has actually become politically respectable and acceptable in America on the left, whereas in America, even the left was scared to use a word like socialism because it was considered a bad word. What's interesting is that there has been, on the one hand, a sort of radicalization, particularly of young people, and on the other hand, this phenomenon I've described to you of the 2 backlashes against globalization, cultural as well as economic. And the result is a form of polarization. So if we are finding every society getting more and more polarized, whether it's the America of Trump, the Britain of Brexit, the France where the choice seems to be between a Macron who created a party months before he won an election with it, and a Marine Le Pen who seems to want to undo every premise of the modern French Republic. If those are the kinds of choices, and of course in India, the increasing polarization between the two sets of political parties here, we are looking at a world which is divided within each country as well as between countries. And that has to be a troubling prospect. All one can do is to hope that people understand all these things, come to terms with it, and move in a constructive way, I hope, towards addressing and resolving these challenges.
We'll open to questions now because I know there'll be heaps of questions. There's one there. We can start with that since it'll be easy to pass the mic there. $1. Raise your hands like properly because I can't see. If there are people at the back, we won't be able to see it.
Is there a second mic that can go to the next person?
You want this one?
Yeah.
You can ask your question. Not working.
This one is working. This one is working.
Yeah, it's working. Okay. Hello, sir. Thank you for the talk. You were talking about how, the BJP thinks that there's just a few people who are running out, few leftists who are just protesting. But we have to see that there are these people who are protesting for the CA or who are with the government. They are also real people. They are posts coming up by real people whom I know, for example. And for the longest time, the anti-right have, in a way, considered these right-wing leaders fools. So, are we getting alienated too much and not addressing the people of the ground? And that's why people are losing faith.
You see, the problem with these sort of real people, I've read many of these posts myself, is that they're proceeding on different premises. They have chosen, as the Americans would say, to drink the Kool-Aid. They have decided to buy in the government's argument that this is just about regularizing a few people who came, the legacy of partition. They have come until 2014. We have to fast track their citizenship. It's not humane. And they have chosen to buy that argument. Why are we rejecting it? I can explain my own stand very clearly. My first rejection is on principle that for the first time in our democratic history, we have made religion a test for anything to do with citizenship. That, to my mind, is wrong in principle because it violates the real heart of what the freedom struggle was all about. The freedom struggle essentially divided, as you know, not on ideological grounds of capitalists versus Marxists or whatever. It didn't divide on geographical grounds. It wasn't northerners versus southerners. It divided on one question alone. Should religion be the determinant of nationhood? And those who said, yes, religion is our identity, that was the idea of Pakistan. They created Pakistan. And everybody else from Mahatma Gandhi on down said, no, our freedom struggle has been for everyone. And we have fought for the freedom of a country that will be for everyone. And the Constitution be right, said Dr. Ambedkar, will reflect that. I've just reviewed, in Open magazine, you'll see an essay by me about the Constituent Assembly debates, a new book that's just come out, which shows that very consciously and deliberately the Founding Fathers made a choice that you cannot use religion as a marker because religion, doing so, assumes preset identities, preset loyalties, that your politics is inferred from, and therefore your rights as a citizen are inferred from a pre-existing affiliation to a religion. That they explicitly rejected. They said independence is about the individual Indian being empowered, and that the politics of India, the democratic politics, will constitute the political life of this country through the choices of individuals. That was a very deliberate founding spirit of our Constitution. The BJP has never believed that. They come from a tradition which rejected the Constitution. Savarkar, Golwalkar, Deen Dayal Upadhyay all said that this is wrong, they said. This Constitution seems to believe that the nation of India is a territory and the Constitution is written for all the people on this territory. No, they said, all three of them, Savarkar, Golwalkar, Upadhyay, the three big thinkers, they all said, no, that is wrong. A nation is not a territory, a nation is a people, and the people of India are only the Hindu people. Everyone else is either a guest, and they specifically say, Golwalkar said that means the Parsis and the Jews, or an interloper, a bandit, somebody who's broken into the house, namely the Muslims and the Christians. That is their vision. Now that's a completely different vision from that of the Constitution, that of the freedom struggle, that of the founders. So when they say this, they are proceeding from a totally different set of premises. But in order to sell it to a very troubled nation, they say, no, this is just about looking after a few people. I had moved an amendment during the debate in Parliament saying, in that case, why don't you just say persecuted minorities? I may still not agree that you should only help persecuted minorities. I would argue you should help everyone persecuted for any reason, from any country. I've been proposing a refugee asylum policy for many years. We've even given a private member's bill draft to the Parliament. But I said, doesn't matter. But if you say persecuted minorities, at least you're not naming religion as a test. But they have chosen to shout me down, actually, and they went ahead and passed it. Now, they can't really get away with claiming it's innocent. The second thing, of course, that bothers us all very much is that the Home Minister explicitly tied the CAA, or CAB as it then was, to the NRC nationwide. Basically, the CAA says, if you can prove you're from these religions and from these countries and so on, we will give you fast track to citizenship. But it leaves out one religion directly. The automatic inference is, if they're going to go up and down the country, asking every Indian for documentation, and 65% of Indians don't have birth certificates. So if we are going to be in a position where people of one of these 6 faiths don't have a birth certificate, something else will be accepted, they'll be allowed to continue as before. Whereas Muslims without documentation risk being disenfranchised, having their voting cards stripped away, because they'll get the question, where are you from? How do we know you're not from Pakistan or Bangladesh? The guy says, look, I'm a Malayali speaker, happens to be working in Bombay. They say, so what, your father could have migrated to Pakistan. Prove to us that you were born here. Prove to us he was born here. And most Indians can't supply that proof. So it's out of anger and anxiety about such a future development also that the protests intensified. That can be diffused. If Mr. Modi and Mr. Shah say, we are dropping the idea of an NRC, we will no longer ask the NPR enumerators, the National Population Register ones, to go to every door asking you where your father and mother were born and asking you for documentary proof. And we will no longer give them the power, which they have given in their rules, to write dubious citizenship against your name. If they are prepared to give all those assurances, that will be the end of the protest. But they are not prepared to give those assurances because this is their intention. Their intention is very much to identify people living in India of so-called dubious citizenship. And as long as that is the case, your well-meaning, sincere, right-wing friends are being led up a blind alley and they'll face social chaos when the wrong moment comes.
As the women of Shaheen Bagh said when they were accused of sitting there for 500 rupees a day, they said they'll give Modi ji a lakh if he just comes and talks to them in the first place and understands their grievances. Short ആയിട്ട് ചോദിക്കാം ഒരുപാട് ആളുകൾ.
Sir, here.
Sir, my question is about present economic situation. Now India's job is 2 million. Okay, so what are the future about youth? You just imagine, suppose you are a finance minister. What are the measures to take to overcome this kind of situation? Now youth are feared about job loss. 2018, 2 million job loss is there. Now our public limited companies like FMCG that are also in crisis situation. In the 2011 recession time, FMCG is safe, but now FMCG is also under critical situation. So what are the measures to take overcome these kind of situations?
Right. First of all, your diagnosis is absolutely correct. We are facing a very major crisis. The fact is that in our country right now, unemployment is at a 46-year high and it's getting worse every month. And every sector, automobile sector has laid off people, FMCGs have gone down, public sector is in crisis. You name it, you're right. Having said that, one can't give glib solutions. Partly it's a result of mistakes they have made for the last 5-6 years, including particularly demonetization. Demonetization resulted in the shutting down of large numbers of small and micro enterprises, those that were employing 2 to 7 people and needed daily cash flow to be able to survive because they took in money from a job in the morning, paid their workers with that same money and took their profits with that money. If there was no money going around, they had to essentially, it was unsustainable for them to maintain their businesses. And large numbers, lakhs of such small enterprises shut down. That was a major revenue generator that's gone. So you can't just suddenly come up with a formula because the way India was working before Modi and company wrecked it is not the India post-demonetization we're seeing today. The second problem we have, of course, is that the government's measures have done nothing to improve demand. You see, for the economy to kick up, you are now so far giving tax breaks to the companies and so on in the hope that supply will increase, they will invest more money, and that the investment may generate jobs. But you're not taking specific steps to put more money in the pockets of ordinary people so they can spend and they can generate demand. That could involve, for example, tax cuts for ordinary income earners. Will the government have the courage to do that? They are afraid at the moment that it will spur inflation and they're also worried about their fiscal deficit. So Modi is worried about Moody's ratings. And in those circumstances, will they think of this? We don't know. There certainly are small fixes they could do. For example, we have an appalling number of vacancies of existing approved jobs in government. Fill the blessed vacancies, at least give some people some hope and employment. And make it easier, genuinely easier for people to start businesses that could employ more people. All of these things are the most elementary level answers. There are more things that expert economists could tell you. Measures and ideas are available. Others have been able to do it. So it's not that we can't. But right now the government seems to be rather clueless. We'll see what Mrs. Sitharaman's budget shows us on the 1st of February.
Sir, good afternoon. My question is regarding the point you referred in your talk, climate change. My question is very simple. Whether the environmental climate change be the new cause of world disorder than the present political unrest world over and particularly in India?
Yes, I do address that in the book. In fact, we have a whole chapter that talks about climate change along with development in the same breath, precisely because climate change is a major factor. But as I said, there are obviously, you see, the focus of the rich countries has been essentially on what's called adaptation. They have changed some of their patterns in order to adapt to climate change, and now it's true that in a place like London, which in the 1950s had such thick smog like Delhi, it used to be called the pea super. The pea super, it was as thick as pea soup that when you walked into the street, you couldn't see the nose of the person about to bang into you because it was so bad. That kind of London is now clean because they've taken measures to adapt. What they've not done, so that's adaptation, what they've not done is mitigation. Mitigation means helping countries like India to be able to actually take steps that would improve our ability to deal with our own sources of pollution. I mentioned earlier, for example, the transfer of affordable technology. Green technologies exist, but they're all in the Western world for the most part, and they're all in private sector hands. So governments are saying, we can't help you with that. You negotiate with the private sector will charge what they charge. And we'll say, well, it's cheaper for us to burn more coal. That's where we are. So the situation is, you're right. I mean, the problem is, there is a problem. What is the answer? I don't see an easy answer, very frankly, because just last week, the Madrid conference on climate failed 10 days ago. And governments are not prepared to come to a consensus because their perspectives are very different. My gut instinct as a politician is it's going to be difficult for democracies to agree on climate change targets because democracies, by definition, are led by people who can't think beyond the next election. I mean, all of us are in the same boat, whether in the Western world or here. 5 years, you've got to come back. If you're going to impose costs on your people in these 5 years for the sake of benefits for their children 25 years from now, you won't survive the next election in 5 years. So you try and avoid that pain. That is the reality we're seeing around the world. So what we can really hope for is the growth, development, invention of new and cheaper technologies that would eventually help mitigate this problem seriously. But I'm not quite sure that isn't pie in the sky, but it seems to me to be the only hope we have at the moment.
Quick thing, we've had 3 questions from men, so now female voices. If any women have questions, after the lady you can ask.
Hello,
Raise
sir.
your hands clearly.
Hello, sir. I have a question. Jeff Bezos, he promised about 1 million jobs, you know. And from what I know of Amazon, Amazon operates on volume. And he's promised the small business owners, the, Kirana Wala stores, that he will make their life very good. What do you think of that? Is that another way of getting, Amazon getting more money from us?
Well, of course, they're in business to get money from us. But at the same time, I think the initiative is very far-seeing and wide-ranging. They are saying, if the problem in India that creates resistance to companies like Amazon is that the mom-and-pop stores, the Kirana shopkeepers, will be affected, then he's saying, we will help them to go online and become themselves players on the Amazon space. So Amazon, as you know, is a platform. It doesn't manufacture the goods. It provides manufacturers and shopkeepers an opportunity and avenue to sell it. So what they're saying is, instead of the small shopkeeper saying, we cannot compete with an Amazon, we will help the small shopkeepers sell on Amazon. And we will give them the training, the resources to go online themselves. And that's where the principal expenditure of $1 billion is going. Undoubtedly, they will create a lot more jobs than the Kirana shopkeepers can, because when you have a business of that scale, you do need all sorts of expertise, inventory managers, warehouse managers, shipping managers, logistics people, the whole sets of professions where they'll be creating jobs and training people in new skills. It's never a zero sum. It's never that the corner shopkeeper loses his place and there is no other job being created. Definitely Amazon will create new jobs, I have no doubt about that. The question that troubles some of us is, what does the government really want? On the one hand, it talks about attracting more investment, and on the other hand, when the investment comes, it disparages the investment because it's not politically convenient to the ruling party. That kind of combination is what troubles us a lot. And my own gut instinct is that we should now bite the bullet, let them and anybody else come in. Many others have explored coming into India, dipped their toe in the water, found it too cold and left. At this rate we'll never. Why can a formerly communist country like China be far more integrated into the world economy than we are? I think it shows that we are far more diffident, far more scared, far more protectionist than even a formerly communist country is.
Do we have
One
questions
question,
from
sir.
women?
One question.
Hold on. No women? No hands raised? You're
All
all
right,
men.
let's ask the men.
Okay, you got the mic first. Other enter, sir.
Yeah. So firstly, I would like to congratulate you for winning the 2019's National Sahitya Academy Award.
Thank you.
During the local elections in Turkey that took place in 2019, the party of the ruling, the Turkish president, the party faced a huge backlash in Ankara, which was a strong region of that party.
It's actually in Istanbul. They lost the mayorship of Istanbul.
Yeah, Erdogan's party lost it there. So do you think, is it because of the presence of some of the strong leaders like Mr. Kamal, who was the opposition leader there, or Mrs. Kenan, who was imprisoned there, or people like Fethullah Gulen? And in India, we lack people like Fethullah Gulen. I'm asking this question because before the 2019 election results were out, I was very much optimistic about a presence of a person like Fethullah Gulen, and day by day, these days, I'm becoming pessimistic about it.
Got it.
What's your take on
opposition?
No, but Fethullah Gulen is a curious example because he's at least demonized by the government as an Islamist extremist. He lives in exile. He's not in Turkey. He's not campaigning. And those who were sympathetic to him have been purged from the armed forces and the government. So we certainly don't want that in India. In India, I hope we'll have somebody within the country who can inspire a large following and win votes against the government. But I think that it's difficult to draw too many analogies from Turkey. I myself have done so in my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, tracing the uncanny parallels a few years apart between Erdogan and Modi. Similar background, small town growing up, similar kind of politics, a lot of uncanny parallels. But some things you have to understand are different. For example, the situation in Turkey is very different. You actually have a very personalized presidential style election for the mayor of the capital city. We don't have that. We have to elect a party to create the chief minister of the national capital region. You don't actually create an individual like the mayor. And the mayor's personality, therefore, the candidate, became a major factor. He was affable, pleasant. He was very much different from President Erdogan. And so more than ideology or Gulen or anything like that, elections like that can often run on personality. Whereas in our system, you have to have a party that can actually win a majority, whether it's in a state, a city, or in the country.
Last question from here.
Yes, sir. My question is, you said there is a new world disorder. Disorder is good so long as it is doing good for the humanity and to a country. If you look at the United States, you would find that under Trump's disorder, America is the lowest rate of unemployment. But compared with India now the growth rate has come down to 4.5%. I've read in some of the works of Mr. Manmohan Singh that unless you have an 8% growth rate, we cannot provide employment for a large number of people. Now, the 7.1% of unemployment, highest in the last 45 years, a generation of people who are now not getting the employment. By the time the economy turns around, the companies will be employing only the younger generation or the new pass-outs. So one set of people who have passed out, they will have to remain unemployed throughout their life. What have you to say to that?
Well, that's not a good prospect, is it? I mean, the fact is that 8% growth is indeed what the BJP promised us. We haven't come anywhere close to it. In fact, we've been plummeting. And the current figures are 5, but in fact, that 5 is possibly really close to 3.5 because of various factors that are not included. So we are not in good shape, and we cannot afford to have a generation of unemployed. Why do I say that? Because in a country like ours, there is nothing more dangerous to social peace and cohesion than a legion of unemployed, unemployable young men. I mean, we've had 165 districts out of our, 640, where Maoist incidents have occurred. Naxalites may have bombed a police station or kidnapped somebody or shot somebody up or stolen guns, whatever it may be. The incidents may be relatively minor, but what prompts these incidents? Very clearly, it's frustration. It's a sense on the part of these young people they have no stake in this country, no stake in this economy, no future here. So they're vulnerable to the blandishments of somebody offering them 1,000 rupees and a Kalashnikov. That is the great danger. So no, we cannot afford an entire generation to be unemployed. I think we have to find ways. And if they are, believe me, they'll vote this government out and give a chance to somebody else who will want to employ them.
So the answer is vote Congress. Thank you very much for listening. We've got the next session, which will start very soon.